I think it's largely going to be a restatement of arguments we're pretty familiar with, namely by leaving the customs union, the UK will have the ability to strike its own free trade deals and look for deals outside of the EU, which is the real growth area in terms of the world economy. And for many Brexiteers, that is the golden opportunity of Brexit, to take advantage of all these untapped markets. The trouble is, into that fray has stepped Sir Martin Donnelly, who he is the man who used to run Liam Fox's department, the International Trade Department, until March last year. So he was the man sitting next to Liam Fox, coming up with all these plans. And this morning, he's taken something of a wrecking ball to Dr. Fox's argument, saying that leaving the customs union and the single market is such a bad idea, would be so damaging that a future UK government is probably going to have to ask to rejoin the single market and the customs union, because, he says, it would place British companies at a competitive disadvantage with the rest of the EU. He suggests that it would deter inward investment, that British producers would be less competitive because they wouldn't have to abide by the rigours of the internal market. And he says the UK would go from being one of the most open economies in the world to being one of the most bureaucratic. And he lists all the different bits of regulation and paperwork British companies would have to comply with to export to the EU. So country of origin regulations, hygiene regulations, security regulations, VAT payments. And crucially, he says that if we hope that we will be able to secure more lucrative deals outside of the EU than through the EU, we are kidding ourselves.
Well, if you look at where we are now, with fair and equal access to the very large, rich EU market, which is nearly half of our service and goods exports, plus preferential access to other markets, which gets us up to about 3/5 of our trade, if you're going to give that up for the promise of some bilateral deals with markets that are much less important to us, well, it's like giving up a 3-course meal for a packet of crisps. It's just not equivalent, and we have to recognise that reality before we take this decision.
And as if that wasn't good enough, Sir Martin also says the British government's objective of negotiating near frictionless trade with the EU outside the single market doesn't need a crack negotiating team. He says it needs a fairy godmother.
Well, that is fairly crushing stuff, isn't it, for Liam Fox personally and the government. How will he take that on, do you think, the International Trade Secretary?
Well, there's just a fundamental disagreement. I mean, we've already heard a little bit from Boris Johnson when he was asked about this, just saying he profoundly disagrees with his analysis. They believe that the real sort of golden goose of Brexit are these markets outside of the EU, which we have failed to tap into at the moment. But let's be honest, the timing of the speech of the intervention could hardly be worse, because here we have Liam Fox making one of the keynote Brexit speech, the road to Brexit. We've heard from Boris Johnson, we've heard from David Davis, we heard a little bit from Mrs May. We'll hear more at the end of the week. This was Liam Fox's moment, and along comes his former top civil servant to basically try and debunk pretty much everything he's got to say. And why this matters, I think, is because this follows very obviously from Jeremy Corbyn positioning Labour on the side of the customs union. We know the CBI, the IOD even seems sympathetic to the customs union. And now, added on top of all that, we have Liam Fox's former top man saying you'd be daft to leave the customs union and the single market.
Norman Smith, thank you. We'll let you go and listen to that speech. Marvin Rees, Bristol voted nearly 62% to remain. Following on the back of Jeremy Corbyn confirming Labour's position of wanting a customs union with the EU, would you like to see him go further and say that Britain should remain in the single market as well?
Well, I think this is the best we can do while not being part of the EU, so I absolutely welcome it. I mean, it's absolutely in our city's interest to remain as close as we can. 88% of our exports from Bristol go into our EU partners. I've had businesses in the city already talk about losing orders as firms on the continent begin to make decisions that disadvantage Bristol-based businesses. What we need at a local level, what we need in cities all around this country is some certainty. We need a plan. And one of the good things that we've got from Jeremy's speech is to give us an idea of what's going to actually happen. And what we're not getting from government is any clarity on what's on the table.
Well, why not push for going further? Like so many Labour MPs, they want to see Labour say that Britain will remain part of the single market too.
Well, I think we need to respect the vote. As I said, I respect the national referendum result, but actually in my own city, also as a locally elected leader, I just want to push as much as possible to keep Labour, the city, connected to the European market. But I really support what Jeremy's doing right now. We must remain as close as we can to protect the interests of our businesses and all the employment that comes from it. And this argument around sovereignty, I think it's one that I get incredibly frustrated with. If we impoverish people, we are not more sovereign.
But what about Labour leavers who said we wanted to take back control?
Well, I don't agree with it. I mean, I just think the whole argument about taking back control is a false argument.
So people who voted leave and voted for the Labour Party were wrong?
If we impoverish people, they are not more sovereign.
Let's leave it there.